Chapter 3. The Bath. Marcus had spent the day tied to the mainmast with the others, watching the ship live around him as if he were no more than a barrel lashed for transport. The singing siren moved with confidence. Men and women climbed rigging, hauled lines, argued over knots, laughed, ate. No one spared the hostages more than a glance. It should have been a mercy. It felt like being erased. Green came for him in the evening, when the lamps were already lit and the others had long been moved inside the ship. When Green stopped in front of him, Marcus looked up and found himself looking at a man's chest first, broad as a door, worn leather creaking when he moved. The face above it was weathered and unreadable in the way of people who had decided long ago that expression was a luxury. Green held a bucket in one hand, a cup hooked over the rim, a rag draped like surrender. "You," Green said. Marcus's throat tightened. He managed, "Yes." Green crouched, fingers working the rope at Marcus's wrists. Competent. Quick. Not gentle. Not cruel. Just finished. The knot gave. Blood rushed back into Marcus's hands with pins and needles pain. "Wash up," Green said, and thrust the bucket into Marcus's arms. The water sloshed cold against the wood. Soap floated on top, an ugly brown lump that still smelled faintly of rosemary. Marcus blinked. "Wash." "Yourself." Green's gaze flicked over him, taking in salt-stiff hair, sweat, the dirt ground into his collar from a day on deck. "You look like you crawled out of a net." Marcus swallowed. "Yes. Thank you." Green made a sound that might have been amusement and might have been contempt. With him, it was hard to tell. He jerked his chin toward the stern. "There, behind the coils. Out of the way." Marcus went where he was pointed, careful with the bucket, careful with his dignity as if it were something he could still keep by holding it with both hands. He stripped to his shirt and trousers, more than that felt impossible with eyes everywhere, and poured water over his hands, his face, his neck. The cold bit. He scrubbed until his skin stung. He did it thoroughly. He found himself doing it thoroughly and did not understand why. No one in his father's house had ever praised him for being thorough at anything. Here, on a pirate ship, with his wrists still marked by rope, he scrubbed under his nails as if an unseen examiner might judge him. Perhaps he was trying to prove he could be useful. Perhaps he was trying to prove he could be obedient. Perhaps he was trying, without quite admitting it, to be pleasing. The thought made heat crawl up his throat. He rinsed the soap away and dressed again with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be. He wrung the rag and set it back on the bucket's rim like a priest setting down a cloth on an altar. When Marcus was done, Green took the bucket, the cup, and the rag from him. Then, without comment, he caught Marcus's wrists again and retied them, rope firm around skin that was still tender. Marcus inhaled sharply. "Don't make a fuss," Green said, and there was no malice in it. "Only instruction. You'll do better if you keep your head." Marcus swallowed. "Yes." Green jerked his chin. "Come." Marcus followed, hands bound in front of him, rope rasping with each step. Below decks, the ship smelled different. Less wind, more people, more wood and old salt, and the faint sourness of stored food. Lanterns hung in iron brackets, their light warm and narrow, leaving corners to darkness. They passed doors. A few were open, showing cramped bunks and hammocks and people playing dice. Others were shut. Green stopped at a door that looked newer than the rest, its hinges oiled, the wood less scarred. He opened it without knocking. "Inside," he said. Marcus stepped in and stopped. The cabin was not lavish, exactly, but it had the feeling of luxury to a man who had spent a day tied to a mast. The bed was wide and neatly made, a blanket folded with care. A small desk was bolted to the floor beside a lantern. Maps were rolled and stacked in a way that suggested they were used, not displayed. A narrow wardrobe stood against one wall. A washstand with a basin and a pitcher waited on a small table. And beside the bed, laid out with deliberate neatness, were shackles. Marcus felt his stomach drop. Not crude iron meant to break wrists. These were almost gentle, padded, adjustable, thoughtful. That was what made them worse. Green shut the door behind them and leaned back against it, arms folded. Trey Blacksail stood near the desk, half turned toward Marcus. In the cabin's lamplight, the captain looked less like a story and more like a man. Solid, scarred, tired at the edges. Dark hair cropped close. Dark eyes that missed nothing. Marcus remembered the way those eyes had looked at him on deck. Hungry, appraising. His face warmed again, traitor that it was. The captain confirmed his name, that he clearly knew, and then held the shackles up to him as if for inspection. Marcus felt himself pale, and then blush. He knew what they were, what they meant, what wearing them made him. A part of him that had been raised as a lord's son recoiled in horror, but the young man who had always felt out of place in that world eyed them with something that felt like hunger. Trey promised not to harm him, and the man at the door, who he now knew was called Green, was stone-faced about it. At least not a lie worth sneering over. Then the cuffs were fastened around his wrists. Marcus complied with every tactile demand the calloused fingers made of his wrist without a thought, too lost in a storm of conflicting feelings rolling inside him. The restraints were indeed comfortable. The words to ask about what this was to be died on his lips. Trey seemed to find it amusing. The fragmented conversation between Trey and his first mate contained way more in-tone and silences that the cautious words expressed. He filed it away for later, understanding that there was history there he did not know but might learn in the future. The captain moved him to the bed and fastened the chain to the wall ring beside it, leaving him enough slack to sit, to stand, to reach the basin on the table, but not enough to reach the door. Then Marcus was told what he was to be: captain's maid in function, help with dressing and washing. And the bed warming was just that, unless he asked for more. Laced with a promise that if he would ask, it would be entirely on his terms, and possibly more than he bargained for. Marcus felt his ears heat up as excitement slowly claimed a shy victory over fear. Green's eyes held a dull, mild disdain, not directed at Marcus so much as at the scene itself, or perhaps at Trey, or perhaps at the world that made a boy in chains ordinary. Green left. The door shut with a final sound. The cabin seemed smaller without him. The air seemed warmer. Marcus sat on the edge of the bed, wrists chained together and then by a longer length of chain to the wall, and tried to remember how to breathe. Trey reached up and adjusted the cord around his neck. Then the captain turned away to pour water into the wash basin, as if this were the most ordinary thing in the world. "Come here, Marcus," Trey said. "Let's see if you can be useful." Marcus stood and stepped forward because the alternative did not exist. The work began. Trey turned to face him. Marcus reached automatically, then stopped himself, uncertain whether he was permitted to touch. Trey noticed. Of course, Trey noticed. "Undress me," Trey said. It wasn't louder. It didn't need to be. Marcus's fingers found the coat's laces. Leather and wool, worn smooth at the edges. His hands shook slightly. He hated that. Hated the betrayal of his body. Marcus drew a breath, tried to steady his hands, managed only to make the trembling smaller. The coat came off. Then the shirt beneath it, loose and dark. Trey stood still, letting Marcus work. There was a moment when Marcus's fingers brushed the captain's skin at the collarbone, and it felt like touching a heated stone. His mouth went dry. Then he found the binder. He did not know the word for it, not properly. He had seen women bind their chests in plays and in cheap pamphlets, had read enough to understand the concept in theory, but theory did not prepare him for the heavy wrap of cloth under a man's shirt. The tightness, the straps. His hands froze. Trey's voice came soft and sweet. as if speaking to a child who had wandered too close to a cliff. "You will be quiet about anything you see in this cabin," the captain said, "or I'll cut out your tongue." Marcus stared at the knots. His heart hammered so hard it made his wrists ache against the cuffs. "Do you understand?" Trey asked. Marcus found his voice somewhere behind his teeth. "Yes, Captain." The words came out as a stutter. He hated that too. Trey's fingers brushed his wrist, not comforting, claiming. Good. He worked the binder's fastenings with careful fingers. The cloth came away in layers. Underneath, Trey was not what Marcus expected, and he didn't know what he'd expected. It was simply a body that had been fought over by the world and had fought back. A woman's body that had spent years pretending to be something else and grown used to it, covered in scars, both old and new. Scars ran across Trey's ribs, pale and older, some jagged as if made by teeth or claws, others clean and straight like a blade's work. There were fresher ones too, angry red lines still healing, a bruise that had turned the color of old plums beneath the skin. Marcus's stomach turned, not from revulsion, from the realization that this was real, that this captain, this terror, bled like anyone else, that the sea did not make you invincible, it only made you harder to kill. Trey caught him looking and said flatly, "Don't stare." Marcus dropped his gaze at once. "Sorry, Captain." "Water," Trey said. Marcus turned to the basin. His hands were clumsy now, chained and trembling. He dipped the rag into the water, wrung it out, and brought it back. Trey sat on the edge of the bed, facing away. The captain's back was covered in scars, too. Oldest of them were lash marks, now faded thin and white. "Scrub," Trey said. "Properly. My back's been itching for days." Marcus pressed the damp rag to Trey's shoulder blade and began. The work was intimate in a way Marcus had not understood until his hands were on someone else's skin. The rag slid over the scars, over healed skin, over new wounds. Trey hissed once when Marcus touched a healing cut too roughly. "Sorry," Marcus said again, mortified. "Pay attention," Trey replied. Not angry, just exact. So Marcus paid attention. He adjusted pressure. He learned the map of Trey's back with his hands the way he might have learned a coastline from a chart. Careful, methodical, trying not to think about what the learning meant. He tried to think of the most boring book in the world. There had been one at school, a heavy theological tract on the gods of the four kingdoms. Dense arguments about divinity and duty and sin, written in a style that turned every sentence into a stone you had to lift before you could move on. Marcus had been assigned it as punishment once for reading poetry under the desk. He pictured its cover, brown leather, no ornament, the smell of dust. He began to recite its first chapter in his head. It did not help. Trey shifted, and Marcus had to move the rag lower, over ribs, over the curve of a waist, over skin that had been held tight for years. Trey did not let him skip anything. "All of it," the captain said, voice low. "Blush all you want, but do not skip an inch." Marcus's face burned hotter. His breath came shallow. His hands did what they were told. It felt like torture, exquisite, relentless torture, because Trey sat there as if nothing was happening, as if being washed by a hostage were as ordinary as being shaved. And Marcus felt the chain each time he leaned too far, felt the limits, felt his own body respond in ways that made him want to crawl out of his skin. He scrubbed. He rinsed the rag. He scrubbed again. When he finally finished and lifted the rag away, Trey exhaled slowly, as if relieved. "Better," Trey said. There was satisfaction in it, almost childish. Gods. Better. Marcus looked down at the rag in his hands as if it might accuse him. Trey stood and reached for a towel, drying with quick, practiced movements that avoided lingering. Then Trey pointed to the wardrobe. Sleep clothes, top shelf. Marcus went, the chain clinking softly. He found folded garments, trousers of dark linen, a loose shirt. Masculine, practical. If Trey had to roll out of bed and onto deck in the night, a coat over this would make her captain-shaped again. Marcus held them out with hands that still betrayed him. Trey let him dress her. No binder for the night. The relief of that should have been simple. It wasn't. The absence meant Trey felt more real under his fingers, and Marcus's shame deepened. When Trey was dressed, the captain looked at Marcus with a considering expression that made Marcus want to hide. Clothes off, Trey said after a moment of scrutiny. Marcus stared. Captain? All of them, Trey said, with the same flat certainty as before. Get in my bed and warm it. I'm working. Marcus's throat went tight. He reached for the buttons of his shirt. The chain made it impossible to pull it off. He tugged and the cuff bit softly into his wrists. He could not slip the shirt over his head with his left hand chained to the wall and hands chained together. Trey watched him struggle for 2 heartbeats, then stepped close. Hold still, Trey said. Marcus did as he was told. The key turned, cuff parted from the chain linking his hands. The lock that attached him to the wall was next. For a moment, Marcus was unchained entirely, wearing just the cuffs, and his heart lurched like a bird finding the door open. Trey's hand settled on his shoulder, firm, grounding. Not gentle, not cruel, possessive. Don't be stupid, Trey murmured as if reading the thought. Marcus's face burned. I wasn't going to. Trey's mouth twitched. Of course not. It was not a belief. It was an agreement to let him keep his dignity as long as he behaved. Marcus undressed quickly, clumsy with haste. Shirt off, trousers off. He kept his back turned to the captain as much as he could, as if that could hide him from the fact of himself, now painfully aware of something he had not known when he entered this room. The captain was a woman. Trey watched him without moving, eyes exploring. Marcus could feel the captain's gaze like heat on his skin. When Marcus turned and climbed into the bed, he did it fast, pulling the blanket up as if cloth could be armor. The sheets smelled faintly of salt and something herbal. Clean. Unfairly clean. He lay on his side, facing the wall, because facing Trey felt impossible, but left the cuffs accessible over the blanket. Behind him, Trey reattached the cuff and the chain with practiced hands. Limits restored. Good. As a reward for obedience, I am not chaining your hands together for the night. Don't get clever, Trey said, voice idle, and went to the desk. The lantern's light made a small circle around Trey. Quill, paper, a rolled chart unspooled and weighed at the corners. The captain sat and began to write, head bent, dark hair catching a copper edge in the flame. Marcus lay very still. He was naked, chained, in a pirate's bed. He should have been sobbing. He should have been praying like Lord Fenn. He should have been planning an escape. Instead, his body felt too awake, and his mind kept slipping into speculations that were absolutely not proper. This isn't happening, some part of him insisted. This will end. You'll wake. You'll be back on the Merchant's Promise with Pip complaining about the sea. But the cuffs were real. The chain was real. The captain's presence in the room was real. He turned to watch Trey work. The chain clinked softly as he did. Trey worked for a long time. The scratch of the quill was steady, methodical. Competence made sound. Marcus watched the lantern flame dance and tried again to summon that boring theological book. He remembered the passage on North Star. North Star, the tract had explained, was neither man nor woman, but also both. An old god, older than borders, worshipped in the north where winter made liars of all soft categories. A deity of travelers who did not fit, of sailors who crossed between lands, a god whose divine calling was leading the lost home. Marcus had read it once and found it slightly interesting despite himself. Now, lying in this bed, He couldn't make even theology boring. It seemed to resonate with his life in ways he had never expected. His eyes closed at some point. His body sank into the mattress, warmth gathering under the blanket. His breath slowed. He was almost asleep when the bed shifted. A body slid in behind him, between him and the wall, careful of the chain. Warmth pressed to his back. An arm draped over his waist, heavy enough to be real, light enough to be deliberate. Trey's breath touched the back of his neck. In the dark voice, soft, almost amused, the captain whispered, "If you wet the bed, you're sleeping on the floor, naked." Marcus's eyes flew open. His heart kicked. "I won't," he managed, voice hoarse. Trey's quiet chuckle vibrated against his spine. "Good." The captain settled closer, and Marcus felt the shape of Trey behind him. Soft in all the places a woman was supposed to be soft, and man was not. Dangerous in the way a knife was dangerous even when laid down. Marcus tried his best to keep remembering that very boring book. He thought of North Star again, and this time the memory felt like a lantern held up in a storm. Inadequate, but something. Neither man nor woman, but also both. A God you prayed to when you were lost. Marcus lay very still in the circle of Trey's arm and found, with a shock that tasted like truth, that terror was still there, but it was braided now with something that made his skin hum. He did not know what would happen tomorrow. He did not know what would happen when ransom was demanded, when his father decided his worth. He did not know whether this would ruin him. He only knew, as sleep finally took him, that whatever happened, this strange, dangerous closeness was not something he would ever regret, even if it got him killed.